Hi everyone, welcome to episode 16. Today we're going to be looking at some weapon effects. Firstly, getting shells ejecting from the gun when we shoot, and secondly, some muzzle flashes. So let's start off by dragging the gun prefab somewhere into our scene. I'm just going to press F to focus in on that, and I want to add a empty child object. I'm going to call this something like shell ejection point. I'm sorry if my gun terminology is not quite up to scratch, but you get the idea. This is the point at which the shells will be ejected from the gun. You can maybe just rotate this up a bit so that they come out in a sort of arc. Yeah, something like that should be fine. You can just apply the change to the prefab and delete the gun from the scene. And now let's create the actual shell prefab. So I'm going to use the bullet as a template for that. So just rename the bullet to shell and create a new prefab out of that. And we'll want to remove the projectile script and instead create a new one called shell. Let's assign that. Did I get it? Nope. Here we go. We're also going to want to add a rigid body and a box collider to it so that it can collide with stuff in the scene. So physics, rigid body, physics, box collider. Maybe also just scale this out a bit. So we're going to probably want the shell to fade out after a couple of seconds, just so that it doesn't sort of clog up the scene. So I'm going to create a new material over here. I'll just duplicate bullet, call this shell, and I'm going to leave it the same except for the rendering mode. I'm going to change that to fade so that we can make it fade out, and just assign that to the shell over there, and that should be good. Hit apply and delete. Okay, so let's go into our shell script, open it up, and we're going to probably first of all want to get a force applied to the rigid body. So let's get a reference to that rigid body, public rigid body. I'm going to call it my rigid body, and we can assign that in the inspector in a moment. But for now, let's just say my rigid body.add force, and we want to add the force to the side. So we can say transform.right as the direction, and just multiply that by some variable force, which we'll create in a moment. We probably don't want this force to be the same for each shell, since then each shell will follow the sort of same exact trajectory, and that will maybe look a bit strange. So let's rather create a public float force min, and likewise float force max. And then we can say that our actual float force is equal to a random number somewhere between those two. Okay. We maybe want to add a bit of random rotation as well. So let's say my rigid body.add torque, and I'm just going to give it a random vector 3. So we can say random dot inside unit sphere and multiply that by force. Okay. So as I mentioned, I'd like it to fade out after a couple of seconds. So let's just define a lifetime. Maybe it lasts for 4 seconds, after which it will fade out over a fade time of, say, 2 seconds. And we can create a coroutine to do that fading. So IEnumerator, just call it fade. And we can start off by saying yield return new wait for seconds lifetime. So it will wait for the lifetime to expire before it starts fading. So let's implement that fade. We'll want to create a float for the fade percent. So that's initially equal to 0. Then a float also for the fade speed, which is of course just the just 1 divided by the time that we want it to fade out over. And then let's see. We want to get a reference to our material so that we can affect the color. So material, let me just call that matte, is equal to get component renderer, not renderer, dot material. And then we also want to know our initial color. So color, initial color, is equal to material.color. Okay, so we can now do our little fade loop. So while the percent is less than 1, we increase the percent by time.delta time multiplied by the fade speed. And then we can just say material.color is equal to color.lerp from the initial color to invisible, so color.clear, and we pass in our percent. All right. We wanted to wait a frame between each step of this loop, so yield return null. And once this loop is finished, after percent reaches 1, we can just destroy the shell, since it's now completely invisible. Destroy game object. Okay, so we just need to call this coroutine from the start method. So we can say start coroutine fade. All right. We're going to want to get this. Well, let's actually just assign these variables quickly. So drag in my rigid body, say forcemen maybe 90 and 120, and we want to get these instantiating from the gun. So let's open up the gun script and going to create a public transform shell and a public transform shell ejector for the point at which, I'll just call it shell ejection, for the point from which it will be spawned. So once we actually fire a new projectile, we can say instantiate shell at the shell ejection dot position and the shell ejection dot rotation. Cool, so that should be working if we just go onto the gun prefab and assign these variables. Shell, and for the shell ejection we can just expand the gun prefab and add the shell ejection. Okay, let's test this out. Press play and shoot. Does seem to be firing out some nice shells. Are those fading out? They do appear to be. Okay, I've got myself nicely cornered, but yeah, that seems to be working nicely. So the next thing we want to do is to get some muzzle flashes working. Okay, so I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes creating some simple muzzle flash sprites. You're welcome to skip ahead and just grab the file from the description, but if you'd like to follow along and you have Photoshop or GIMP or something similar, I'm going to create a new canvas, sort of 800 by 400 maybe, and let's see, let's zoom in, and I'm going to create a new layer. I also want to just divide this up into 4 quadrants, so go 50%, and oops, I'd like to drag one out here as well, 50%. Okay, so I'm just going to use my lasso tool to create some rough muzzle flashy type shapes. So over here, maybe something like this. These two sort of going backwards and then a little swoosh, little spurt forwards. Something like that. And then can make another one over here, say like this. I'm kind of running out of ideas for shapes already. Let's see, maybe like so. I don't know, that's a bit odd, but I'm sure it'll be fine. These things will only be visible for a fraction of a second, of course. Let's see. Okay, something like that should be fine. So I want to just fill these all in with a white color, and I'm going to apply a little blur to these. Let me see. I just want to position these a little bit closer to the edge. Something like that should be fine. I don't want the blur to sort of go out of the edges though, so just need to be a little bit careful here. Something like that should be fine. So I'm going to go filter, blur, just add a little radial blur. Maybe, yeah, 3 should be fine. Okay, just something like that, just to make it a little bit more noisy. Go to duplicate it with Command J. And let's go image, adjustments, hue and saturation, create colorize, and just try and make this a sort of orangey color. Yeah, maybe something like that is nice. Okay, I'm going to put that in the background. Yeah, I mean that looks quite nice. I'll maybe just duplicate this once, and it looks much stronger duplicated. Maybe I'll just actually keep that. Just Command E, duplicate it again, and for this one, I'm just going to select the one in the background, go filter, blur, maybe just add a little Gaussian blur, something like that. Okay, so that's looking fairly decent, except for this top right one, which is a bit ugly, but never mind. Let's remove the background layer and just save this. I'm going to call it muzzle flash. I'm going to save it as a PNG. Okay, so let's now go back into Unity, and I'm going to import the muzzle flash that we've either created or you've downloaded from the description. I'm going to put that in my prefabs folder. I'm going to change the texture type from texture to sprite, and I'm going to turn off generate maps, and I'm going to set the sprite mode to multiple, since we've actually got 4 different sprites in this one sheet. And we can hit apply. Let's open up the sprite editor. Want to crop these into the 4 different sprites. So we can go into slice, can say grid by cell size, and this image is 800 by 400, so we want to split it into 400 by 200 blocks. Hit slice, can hit apply, and just close this. So we've now got our 4 different sprite images. Let's drag the gun into the scene again. Press F, and I'm going to go into the projectile spawn and just create a new empty child. Call this muzzle flash. And under that, I'm just going to drag in a muzzle flash. Okay, just reset the transform so that it appears. Wow, that's massive. Okay, let's rotate it. Say this is probably going to be 90 and -90. And let's move it forward like so. I'm just going to the muzzle flash and scale this down. Okay, just something like that. I'm also going to duplicate this and just rotate it on the x-axis so that we get this sort of 3D effect. I'll call this muzzle flash 01 and muzzle flash 02. All right, and let's see. Let's create a new script called muzzle flash. Like so. I'm going to apply that to the gun. Open it up, and we're going to want just 2 methods: a public void activate and a void deactivate. Okay, so in activate, let's first of all get a reference to the muzzle flash object. So we can call this public game object. Maybe call it the flash holder. Okay, so when we activate, we say flash holder dot set active true, and when we deactivate, we say flash holder dot set active false. Okay, and probably when we start the game, we'll just want to start with it automatically deactivated. We can just call that. So once we activate it, we want it to deactivate automatically after a sort of small amount of time. So let's create a public float. We can just call that the flash time. And we can just invoke the deactivate method so that it deactivates after flash time. Okay. We're going to want to just pick a random one of those 4 sprites to be displayed. So let's get an array of those sprites. We can say public sprite array. We can call these our flash sprites. Okay, and we're going to want to also going to want to have an array for each of these sprite renderers here, the two. So public sprite renderer array, and we can call that the sprite renderer. Okay, so I'll call that sprite renderers. So when we activate, we'll first want to get a random index for our flash sprites. So int, call it flash sprite index is equal to random.range between 0 and the number of flash sprites we have, so flash sprites.length. And then we can just do a little for loop through each of our two sprite renderers. So for int I equals 0, I less than sprite renderers, sprite renderers dot length I plus. We want to set sprite renderers I. Want to set the sprite equal to flash sprites with an index of the random flash sprite index we created. Okay, so that looks good. We just want to go now into our gun script. Hang on, apparently I made a little error. Missing a semicolon. Okay. We'll want to go into our gun script, and we want to create a public muzzle flash variable. Actually, this doesn't need to be public. We can just say muzzle flash, and we can get this in our start method. So void start, muzzle flash, not capitals, muzzle flash equals get component muzzle flash. All right, and then when we shoot, we just say muzzle flash dot activate. Cool, let's try this out. So on our gun, we're going to want to assign all of these things. So the flash holder is just this muzzle flash object here. Flash time, maybe that's equal to 0.1. For the flash sprites, let's go here and just assign each of these. All right, last one. And the sprite renderers are just these two guys over here. Flash 01 and Flash 02. Cool, let's apply. And I'm going to put this gun here in the center, because what would be nice to have as well is just when these flashes appear to actually have a light source as well under the muzzle flash. So let's create a empty child and just add a light component. Light, okay, so point is good. Let's just see, can make this a yellowish color, like so. Doesn't need any shadows. It's maybe affecting a bit too large of an area. Something like that with quite a high intensity should be pretty good. Okay, let's try that. I'm just going to call this light and apply and delete it from the scene. And let's run the game. Okay, cool. So we've got a little muzzle flash appearing. I want to maybe just make it appear for a briefer period of time, say 0.05 perhaps. Let's see how that looks. Yeah, that's a little snappier. Yeah, that's pretty cool, I think. The light is maybe a bit distracting. I'm going to tone that down. Let's see if I can just bring this into the scene, find my light, maybe change the intensity down to 4. Let's apply and try it again. Yeah, it's a little less distracting. Could maybe be even lower, but fiddle with that some other time. So there's actually just one small optimization I'd still like to make. If we go into our shell object and go layer, add layer, we can add in a shell layer. and let's apply that to the shell. So what we're going to do is make it so that the shells don't need to worry about collisions with other shells. So we can just go into Edit, Project Settings, Physics, and we can say the shell layer doesn't collide with other shells. It does collide with the obstacles, it does collide with the floor, it doesn't need to collide with the enemy, UI, water, or any of these other things. So yeah, that will just speed up the sort of collision detection for the shells a little bit. Cool, so that's everything. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in episode 17. Cheers.